I grew up with my father's memories of the war from when I was a little girl, and I absorbed all his hurt and his pain, and I ended up having a form of amnesia which lifted about 10 years ago. And then I understood I had always felt a lot of pain when I was making art, and then I understood what the pain was. The pain was the pain of war. And then I began making art of war, about war, and looking at the Holocaust, wanting to understand my German father's story. And I started making work in response to the Holocaust, and making work that was about my father. And then I found it was very hard for me to keep on continuing. And about 2 years ago, I enrolled in an advanced drawing course with Wendy Welch at Visa. And she taught me how to be able to keep drawing even though I might be feeling pain. And I chose to choose as my subject the bombing of civilians during World War II, particularly of the German cities. And I had discovered my grandmother had lived through that time. So it was a heartfelt response to historical photos, and it was very tricky for me to look at some of the images, but as I started to draw them, I noticed that these historical photos, which seemed very distant, and as I started, the expressive way I was drawing made these photos come alive. I felt that this was an important side of the war to consider, because most of the people affected by bombings in England and in Germany and elsewhere in Europe were women and children. And this was a story that largely affected the homes. And we are very accustomed to men's stories and battle stories, and we know about the stories of those who flew these missions, and we know about Rosie the Riveter and the heroics, but we don't know what happened on the ground. So these are studies of bombed cities, and I take pictures, I take larger pictures and photograph them, and then take very tiny sections of the pictures and make these abstract drawings from them. So this is a microcosm of the destruction. And the buildings start to become alive. It's almost like you can imagine being in the fires, in the great firestorms, or you can imagine that somehow there are still figures in these buildings, like ghosts or memories of the people that used to live there. There's an artist, Anthony Gormley, who has a wonderful quote that says, "We use the language of architecture to express the inner state of the body." And I feel that these drawings remind me of ribs and sinews and muscles, of our body's interior. And for all through history, houses and buildings have represented human beings. So this becomes a symbolic. One very sad, well, I don't know if it's sad or ironic or tragic. I watched a newsreel story from the time that showed the bombed homes, and said, "We have emptied the Nazis' nest," the Nazi nest, almost like the homes were rats' nests. And I thought, there were no Nazis at home. There were women and children who were very frightened. So I believe it's that photo that was a response to that newsreel. This one in the far right in the corner reminded me very much of that newsreel image. These are responses to historical photos of children of the time. I made them in December and January, and I was surprised because I was going to make more architectural work, and I really felt I needed to make children, I had been working with very small children, and make them large, and it felt important that not only did I portray German children from the time, but little English children, little English evacuees who were also, their lives were changed forever because of the German bombing campaign on London. And I wanted to show how universal that this story of the bombing of cities that began in World War II is not just a German story. It's not just an English story. It's a story that concerns children, and that they are the ones who bear the cost of bombing campaigns because of our failure as adults. So four of these children, these four, are little German children, particularly these are little refugees. And these three are the little English children, and they've got their little knapsacks with their gas masks. And I did them expressively. My drawings, I layer them with charcoal and Conte crayon, and then work away with eraser, and then add white Conte, and then I break the surface, and I try to make the drawing tactile, like it's something that you can touch and feel. My work with this subject began with very small drawings of distressed paper. I use Stonehenge, and I crushed it, and I put it in the sink and crushed it, and then opened it up and let it dry. And then I cut it apart, and I would draw with ink or pen portraits or scenes from historical photos, and then I would take them back and I would wet them again and rub into them again. These particular drawings are of rubble. I avoided as much as I could depicting the actual victims of the bombings because the photos are really distressing and really gruesome. But there was one figure of a mother and a child that stayed with me, and the middle one is them as well. And if we just go back into the main hall, I've depicted them here again. And I made a literal drawing of them. So what looks like expressive marks is actually a representation of them. And what was very touching in many of the images from the aftermath of the bombings is that clothing would remain intact, and it was like the bodies were mummified because of the intense heat. But when I did this drawing, it was lifeless. It was a lifeless drawing, and it didn't say any more than what the photograph had already said. But when I came home, I decided to cut her up and make her a Madonna figure, make her something that we might find in a place of worship or a place of remembrance. And she I call her the Queen of Heaven now, but she's like she's like a crow, or she's like an angel or a protector or the Madonna. And I found out today that Mary, the mother of Jesus, is called the Queen of Heaven in traditions. I did not know that at the time. And we moved through to a grotto that I had originally thought I would make very dark, but it has become a place of light, even as it's remembering sadness and tragedy and war and this drawing, I did not even know I was going to be in this exhibition. It was a drawing I'd done a while ago, but when I was thinking of an altarpiece, this became the natural choice. But the interesting story behind this is the figure in the middle is an adaptation of Raphael's famous painting. And I found out that that very painting is called the Dresden Madonna. And she was taken from Dresden by the Russians and recently restored to Dresden. So there was an irony. She's been a Madonna figure that's haunted me for the last 10 years, and to discover that she was actually belonged to the city. And again, very lightly, I referred to an altarpiece with Elizabeth and Anthony and used two figures that were found in after the bombing of Dresden on either side of her. And these figures here, the portraits, I'm referencing our little medallions that we might wear on our neck, or our family portraits. My mother has, from the wartime, these images of her parents' children, and they all have little circles and they all have these smoky halos around them. So I'm referring to the period of children portraiture, but I'm also referring to the idea of the extinguishing of the image and the blackening of human bodies as a result of firebombing and high heat. But yet, we can look at these images and engage with them. We're not repelled by them, we're drawn in. And my hope is that even though my work is about tragedy, is about death, that we are reminded of the life of children and the hope that children are in a society, and so that when we can avoid this idea that any society is totally evil or any society is totally dark, because with children there is still hope that love and goodness and innocence and change will prevail. And I feel we have that example in Germany itself, because as I was doing this work, I wondered who would want to see this work about an historical event, and especially an historical event about Germany, which is guilty of such horror towards civilians itself. And yet, as I was delving into this history of the fire bombings of Germany, the whole situation in Syria came to our living rooms in the news. And I saw in amazement as Germany opened up its doors and its arms to Syrian refugees. And I realised that this story, the story of Germany having lost its homes, lost its children, and been the subject of an enormous amount of refugees, themselves 7 million refugees as a result of this bombing, and also being responsible for the perpetration of hurt towards civilians somehow has processed that history, that collective history, and has become compassionate toward the other in a way that many of us now can really learn from. So to see my work that I thought may not be relevant to our time become very relevant to our time was surprising to me. So I realised I was very conscious about sharing this work from the German side, because it's not a side of war that we have been open to. We have not really wanted to understand what the war was like from within Germany. But I realised that I'm in an awkward but maybe privileged position of understanding all sides of war because of my mother, and my grandfather was in the Dutch underground, which was the Dutch resistance, and my father. But I grew up in Australia and I live here in Canada, and Canada saved Holland. And I know the American stories and the British stories, and I feel that I have an understanding of many sides of war, and I felt that if anybody was going to tell another side of war, another story, and that it would be appropriate to do so from a perspective that took into account everybody's story.